2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 8. Remember Jesus Christ, risen from the dead, the offspring of David, as preached in my gospel.
And Christ dies and raises again on the third day for our justification. And there's another imputation. The righteousness of Christ is actually imputed to us so that God can be both just and the justifier of the one who places faith in Jesus Christ, so that all those who come to Christ may enter in, so that all those who place faith in Christ might be saved, but not only saved, but sanctified. And we're further sanctified throughout this life by the very same gospel that saves us, until one day when it's all said and done, we're not just saved from the penalty of sin. We're not just saved from the power of sin, but one day we're glorified and saved from the very presence of sin. That's the gospel that we preach. That's the gospel that we need. And that's the gospel that's more than enough.
Hello everyone. Welcome to the Selah podcast, a podcast where we strive to produce biblical theology into lyrical doxology. We hope to do this by three motivations, which are to examine, to exhort, and edify, to learn more about him from scripture, to grow closer with Jesus in prayer, and to live for God in worship. As usual, I'm your co-host, Joseph Ramos, and on the other end of the table is the other co-host of this podcast,
Judge.
And for the tonight's episode, it is titled Reminisce, and it is focusing on the topic of the resurrection. And more importantly, tonight we'll be dissecting why, not only the importance of it, but why it is a historical and actual event in the first place. So with that, judges, would you like to, because we have a special guest for this episode, would you like to get the guest?
I'll be right back.
Yeah. So about this guest, I think we've known him for I've known him for several years now, and here he is.
All right.
Oh,
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
glad to have you here too, man.
Yeah. This is it's my first time. I've never done this before, so
Yeah.
you can show me the ropes. That'd be cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So generally, you just want to speak, project into the mic, and just want to make sure you use a lot of filler words to sound smart.
Oh yeah. Like henceforth,
thus, and to sum up everything that has been stated so far, in my honest and utmost conclusion.
Yeah, all the little like tricks to increase the word count on your essay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But anyway, judges, before I ask you, and if you notice, it's a little different. We have a TV in the middle. I guess technically, aside from you, the TV is the special guest. Technically speaking.
Yeah.
Technically speaking.
I'm like, it's an extension of me, I guess. I don't know.
Technically. So yeah, with that, it's a bit unique because Judges has slides for his not only he'll expound more on what he did earlier this year, but it's also pertaining for tonight's episode, and the slides will be supplemental to what he will be talking about, since this is mainly touching on his workshop material. But before we get into that, I do have a icebreaker question for you, Judges.
Oh, okay.
That I definitely didn't come up with as of now. I definitely spent a lot of time pondering on this question.
I don't know what's worse, like depending on if the nature of the questions you're asking, whether it actually was like thought of for a long time, or if it's just randomly improvised. I don't know what's worse, man. If this is like the nature of the question that I'm thinking, like, no, but
we'll see. All right, judges. Do you want? Actually, I'll start off. I have two. So,
oh man.
First question. You've heard of this before, but I need to prompt and pose this question in a setting like this. It's a would you rather question.
Oh boy.
You know what it is already. You know what it is already, I think. And audio listeners, I really want you to pay attention to the wording of this question.
Is this appropriate or oh my gosh, is that a dumb one?
We'll see.
Oh
We'll see.
my
Audio.
gosh.
It's a preface. Audio listeners, you would really want to pay attention to the wording here. Wording is
That does
is
not
very
help.
important.
It doesn't help.
It
I don't
does.
get it.
You
I
have-
don't get it.
Okay, ready? So the first question is, all right, would you rather have unlimited bacon, but no more games? Okay, hold on. You have to let me. You have to let me. You have to break.
So
you have to let me
unlimited
finish-
bacon.
Yeah,
but
hold
no
on.
more-
You have to let
yeah.
me finish the question because I understand the question is really heavy to understand and understanding concept. A lot of things going on here. Okay. Ready? All right. Would you rather have unlimited bacon, but no more games, or would you rather have games, unlimited games, and no games?
What am I supposed to- like,
Would you? I understand it might be really hard to digest. Would you like me to re-say the question?
first off, define game.
Games. So games could be any games, like mind games, field games. It could be any type of activity that could involve some type of fun or group participation. And I guess if you want to differentiate, actually, let me. I feel like to help you understand better, let me re-say the question.
Oh my gosh.
Would you rather have unlimited bacon, but no more video games? Or would you rather have games, unlimited games, and no games? Again, the grammar is very important here. The wording is very important.
Maybe if you wrote it out, I would understand better because I need to see the punctuation here.
No, hold on. Unlimited bacon, but no more video games. Or bear with me. Stay with me.
I'm trying to save my brain power for.
Would you rather have games, unlimited games, and no games?
I guess the second option.
Good choice. Good choice. You have chosen the red pill.
I don't know why that's correct, but I'm just gonna go with that one. It sounded more complex.
I would have. Here, let me just say this: if you had picked the unlimited bacon but no more video games, I would have kept prefacing with that. But you have no more video games. And the other option, if you said, but there's no games, I would just say, but you have unlimited games.
Like I just went with that one because it sounded more complex, and we all know that the level of argumentation is the more complex it sounds, the more correct it is, right? That's how it works. Yes.
So you see, judges here has chosen the correct answer.
I don't know why, but yeah, I'm just gonna go with my reasoning, and my reasoning is always correct.
Yeah. See, it's a very thought provoking question. That is very hard to understand at the conceptual level.
I still don't get it, but
All right, I'm moving on to the second question.
there's a second one.
Yeah, this one's more serious. This
Okay,
one's
okay.
like an actual question. Well, depending on how you define a question, because I consider the first one a really deep question, philosophical.
Right. Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
Mm. So, here's my second question. If you had the option to switch to an iPhone, what would convince you? Or what would Apple have to do to make that switch happen? Because you and I both are Android users.
Mm.
And specifically, I believe we've grown up as Android users.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Or at least, if not Android at the beginning, it's definitely not. We didn't have any Apple products to begin with.
Mhm,
So,
mhm. That is a good question because I've always, and you know this, I've maintained the position that the Roman Catholic Church of iPhone,
Uh-huh.
there's a bunch of problems with it that I needed to protest.
mm-hmm.
And so as a Android Protestant, Like, there's a bunch of different features and the things about the iPhone church that is like, I have problems with you guys. There's stuff that
certain
like,
doctrinal issues.
Yeah, certain doctrinal issues is like I can't join you guys if like, for example, and if we went back to even the Protestant Reformation in 1527, I think it was, with Martin Luther, right? If at the Council of Trent, about a dozen years later, that the Catholic Church actually adopted Luther's reforms, then we would have no problem, right? I'm of that same mentality of like, if iPhone adopted the reforms and innovations of Android in its many different forms, whether it be Samsung, whether it be like Google, whether it be all these other different like Protestant Android denominations, I guess, right?
It's a vast umbrella.
Yes, it's a vast umbrella, just like the Protestant umbrella. If iPhone adopted the reforms, and they're slowly starting to do it, both the analogy that I'm using and also literally iPhone, they're starting to do it, but like at this moment, I'm not at the point where I'm just like, I'm not going to jump over to iPhone just yet. But on a serious note, when it comes to like Apple itself, what would it take for me to actually switch over?
Yeah,
because they have been adopting some of their forms, like USB-C, like the new messaging system.
Yeah, RCS, baby.
Yep.
Took Apple however
years?
long. I just know RCS was a thing since Google bought it in 2014.
Yeah,
and so
almost a dozen years, straight up a decade.
I mean, same thing with USB-C. The only reason why they did USB-C was because I believe some type of laws having to do with Europe in terms of traveling via in the air. They had to require a universal charging port for phones. And since iPhones were the only ones that still had the Thunderbolt, or just basically the odd ones out, they eventually accommodated that, because otherwise they would lose a big market of their smartphone consumers in Europe.
Yeah, exactly. So I didn't even know that, but that just makes sense. But yeah, something as seemingly minor as that, like that's still an important like reform that they needed to adopt. So USB-C, they needed the RCS, because RCS does not just affect like the like how streamlined the messaging is, but also even just like the quality of the images that are being sent back and forth, right? That's also a big help.
Also typing indicators and read receipts.
Yes.
Finally. However, just taking forever for FaceTime. Come on. Also, I just want to be very clear. This green bubble, blue bubble issue is only an issue in America, because outside of America, the most used like messaging app is WhatsApp. And there's a reason why Facebook bought that company, or rather they implemented things from WhatsApp. It's because even in Europe, I believe I read an article saying that like about 70% of the population there don't even use iMessage. They just use WhatsApp. So it's basically like no issue, pretty much no issue there with the green bubble, blue bubble. It's somehow only here in America that, more particularly the iPhone consumers, make a big fuss about, I'm texting this person.
Sounds like a you problem. Sounds like a you problem, my guy. It's iPhone's fault. But
exactly, they don't want to break off from the tradition of the Catholic Church.
Yes. They hold sacred tradition near and dear to their hearts, so they don't want to like. But like they're slowly seeing the error of their ways and like adopting some of their reforms again. But again, back to the question of like, what would it take for me to? That's a really interesting question to ask, because they have been adopting a lot of the reforms that I've been like wanting them to adopt. But I guess FaceTime is like a big factor, right? I don't know if that alone will be enough, because again, because at this point they've adopted a lot of the reforms that I've been advocating for. FaceTime is a big part of it. But just I'm too used to like the Android UI, like this, at least the Samsung one, right? Of that sort of UI of the ease of use and the customizability, because I don't have a lot of experience with iPhone. Obviously, I've only like secondhand experience, and like, you know, my mom like, oh, can you help me with this? And I have to like translate it in my mind, like, okay, like you have an iPhone, and like, how do I do this? But a lot of it is like very cardboard cutout, like customizability, I guess, in terms of like how you can customize your phone. I'm not even talking about aesthetically, right? Of like, oh, my wallpapers stuff. Like everyone, that's not an issue. I don't really care about that. It's like the customizability of like how you actually even use the phone, or like placing things, how do I describe it? Like what
do you call it?
And honestly, like the fact that I have Dolby Atmos too. I don't know if like if
I think they're starting to.
They're starting to, because like I have Dolby Atmos on my phone, and like I can really hear the difference, by the way. But like just customizability like that, being able to have stuff like that, and I don't know. We'll have to wait and see for what iPhone rolls out, because we had this conversation like the other day where we've kind of reached, all phones in general have reached this point of like, at this point, the only thing you can't upgrade anymore is just hardware, right?
Yeah, at this point, it's just, and even we see this in the console wars too. Like, it's just to a point where we've reached such technical innovations and leaps forward that now we're at a point where it's diminishing returns in terms of incremental upgrades. Yeah, and like, if you look at a lot of the presentations, like Sony, Apple, Samsung, Google, a lot of it actually is focusing on software things, especially as of now. It's been AI implementation.
But that's my point too, where it's like it would be the software innovations of Samsung or other Android companies, right, that iPhone adopts, that would have to like, that would bring me over. I couldn't care less about the hardware at this point. Oh, like, oh, my camera's better than yours. I really couldn't care less. But like, you know, iPhone's like kind of like sneaking in Android software features and stuff, and like it's just like there will have to come a point where like where I see this like this major change of like oh, you know, we're trying to have almost an ecumenism, which is not what I'm advocating for when it comes to like churches and stuff, but it's an ecumenism between iPhone and Android. Where like I would be more comfortable switching over, where like once there's like this like sort of this clearer bridge between the two, it would be less of a leap for me to go over there. But we will see that as iPhone chooses or chooses not to adopt software features that Android has, like incrementally and stuff. Yeah,
I would agree. I mean, that's been pretty much like 90% of the reason I'm still using Android to this day.
Same.
Because the thing is with Apple, for me, I think I'm pretty much in agreement with you too. And I'd like another thing for me would be making that walled off garden of their ecosystem, like you said, make it more of a what do you call it? Bridge that gap, make it easier to cross between one to the other, if that makes sense. Because right now, it's still very hard. I mean, it's doable, but like, there's obviously caveats. Like, you can't transfer everything. You know what I mean? Like, you can transfer some, but like, you obviously like can't fully like, or seamlessly transition. Rather, there is a process. But there is no seamless transition yet. And what I like about Android is like what you're saying with the Protestants in this case is
sure.
Well, yeah, in this case with the phones, right? Like, since there's so many manufacturers like Google and Samsung, just to name a few, right? What I love about it is I can switch between the two different UIs or versions or their takes of it, like Android OS, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll be missing out at most just a little bit because they have their own like unique twist on like
Yeah.
because I know Google's Android is like very close to the actual stock. Like they customize very little about it. Samsung adds their own twist to it, but it's still like easy to read between the lines, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what I like about that is I can go to a different manufacturer and use their smartphone and like
It's a seamless transition.
it's just so
There's already a
seamless.
huge-
Like
there's already like a clear bridge between the different branches of Android.
mhm.
So that like you can hop from like different phone from different phone. Like honestly, I like the Google Pixel better than this model of Samsung. It's like right or vice versa,
Mm.
right? And it's just like it's easy transition. It's like not too hard. It's like there you go, and I have this for as long as its lifespan, and then until the next thing. It's like maybe I switch back to Samsung because I like their model better. It's like the transition is way easier,
Mhm.
and I feel like I said earlier that I would not have a problem switching to iPhone if it was like that.
Mm.
Like
Exactly.
the switch between Android to Android, if it was like if that transition would be if the as easy as that as easy as that transitioning from Android to iPhone, right?
Yeah.
Like yeah.
I know we could talk a lot more about
Oh,
it,
yeah.
but like,
Yeah.
the big thing still going for both of us is it's just the transition. More specifically, it's still at a point where it's very hard to commit to transitioning,
Yeah.
and vice versa. If
Mhm.
an iPhone user were to switch to an
Mm-hmm.
Android, it's still very. I'd still say it's a very high cost of committing to that transition, right? Whereas, like I know Josiah, he had a Samsung. He still has his S10 as of now, but
Mhm.
like his current driver is now the Google Pixel 8,
Mm.
and his transition was seamless.
Mhm.
I know my previous phone was OnePlus 7 Pro, and now I have the Samsung. I'm back to Samsung, but that just goes to show, like,
Yeah.
I had little to no like
Yeah, like-
issue
yeah,
because the
mhm.
transition is so seamless. But
Yeah, and but another thing about iPhone too is that like each update, right? Each software update just slows down the phone. Like it's like there's that concept of planned obsolescence where like it's kind of a conspiracy theory nowadays, I guess. Like even back in the, like 2015 or something like that, people were like
remember hearing this.
planned obsolescence of like we're going to specifically design it to break down at this point, so you have to buy another one, right? They did that with light bulbs. There's this whole like documentary about planned obsolescence that I've seen. It's pretty interesting. But a lot of electronics, and iPhone isn't guilty of this either. They're not guilty alone.
Yeah.
Of something like planned obsolescence. A lot of like electronics are like that. But I feel like it with iPhones it's especially egregious because of like how they roll out their software updates and how it like kind of degrades the phone over time.
Yeah.
And you have to eventually get it like the next model, like no matter how long you put it off. Like for me, right, I've had this phone since like 2019. It's a S9 Plus, and like it's on its last legs. Really, I could probably push it for a long time still, but it's come to a point where like I'm basically out of memory. Was a crack on my phone. The first time I cracked this phone, like in the 5 years that I've had it, the case, like literally it deteriorated, like fell apart. I'm not even kidding. Like over time, just gradually withered away, and then like, and I'm like, it's not even worth it to get a new phone. I mean, a new case, because this phone is so old that I might as well just get a new phone. So I've been going, like, my phone has been naked for like the past like couple weeks because it finally deteriorated like after 5 years. And and I keep joking with Jar that like, man, God's like, I don't know how how I can make it any more clear to you that you need a new phone, but like, like it's falling apart, it's out of memory, and all these things. And I'm like, I know, it's so old, but like, I'm kind of at this like crossroads of like, am I willing to commit to a jump to iPhone, or am I just gonna pick up the next model of Samsung, whatever that may be, because they have like different products for the smartphones. But yeah, no, that's a big part of also why I don't I'm hesitant to switch over to iPhone because of like the longevity of each model is not quite where it's at for me, my personal preference, as it is with Samsung, as an example. I don't know about the other Android models from different companies, but for me, like the longevity of my Galaxy has been way more than the flagship model of the contemporary flagship model of iPhone. Like I don't even remember which iPhone was like came out at the same time as the S9 Plus, but I can guarantee you that no one is using that one. Basically, no one's using that one compared to like the fact that I'm still using the S9 Plus because it's lasted that long.
Yeah. Just really quickly, like my OnePlus 7 Pro, I got it 2019 January of 2020, basically like the end of 2019 to 2020, and like I don't carry it with me as I used to, but at home I still use it. And like with your S9, right? It like of course it's not as it once was, but the functionality of it compared to like the current gen hardware, like it's not that bad. It actually still holds up in many facets and regards, and that's so surprising. Well, in a way, it's not surprising because it's Android, but it's just like it just goes to show that there is a long-term kind of goal with building these kind of smartphones, at least from the Android manufacturing side. But of course, we could talk about this so much longer and longer, right? But basically the anecdote from this is, to all you iPhone users, get away from the Catholic doctrines and just switch to the Android processor. I'm just kidding.
You don't have to be attached to the sacred traditions of the Catholic Church. You just and like the ahistorical doctrinal developments that have arisen over time. You can join the Android Protestant traditions as they exist as an umbrella. I feel like that's a very like apt analogy too.
I just remember. I mean, this is always with iPhone presentations. If I remember, I think the most recent one said that like now you can put your apps in like folders, and like I don't know if this was this year's or a couple years ago, but I saw the presentation where they said now the wallpaper from your lock screen can be the same as after you unlock it, your home screen. I was like,
that's never been a thing. It always has to be different.
Apparently, it was always like your lock screen when you unlock it, it can't stay as the home screen too. And I'm like, we've had this for years.
Why would that not be an option? Like iPhone 1. Why would that not be an option then?
But then again, it's Apple. Like,
I don't know.
But yeah, I remember stuff like that. I was like, y'all couldn't do that.
Yeah.
Until now, and I'm like, looking at my phone. I'm like, I've done this for like how many years?
I mean, to be fair, I do have like my lock screen is different from my wallpaper, but I'm thinking considering changing my wallpaper though, my home screen. Because it's pretty old. I'm not changing my home screen though. It's a picture of Ronnie.
Also, well, I know I kept saying one last thing, but also like, of course, it's given with its risk. But like, I just love the ability and freedom to download modified or different versions of apps that like,
yeah,
like, either it's modified or like it's just a more stable version.
Yes.
And then like the current one's so unstable.
Yeah. The App Store is for Android. Like it's way more. It's much more of a free market than the iPhone. The iPhone, the App Store, iPhone App Store is heavily curated. That comes with its advantages for sure, like 100%. But I like the free marketplace of ideas that, like for example, the Google Play Store has, because all these different apps that are available, like even the janky ones, whatever. It's just you can try things out, and also the ability to like can you download MP3s on iPhone? MP4s?
I think you can, but I know like the photos and the formats for photos and videos are different. Because I think for iPhones they always have HEIC and the videos are .movs, and I'm like, it's not the industry standard, but okay.
Exactly. No, like literally no one outside of iPhone uses that. Because most of the entire world uses MP4, uses JPEG.
Yeah, general consumer formats are for photos are JPEGs or PNGs, and then videos are mostly MP4s, but sometimes MKVs too. But the idea is that like we've adopted Androids have adopted that for so long that like,
and it's the industry standard, like you said.
Yeah.
So it's like that's also a stinker for me. Where like iPhone, you gotta get on the ball with that one. But yeah.
But anyway, we digress about
Yeah,
the
huge
Catholic
digress.
Church. I mean,
Yeah.
iPhones. iPhones. But
Convinced
anyway.
Protestant, but open to new evidence, I guess. But
But anyway, now judges, I wanted to ask you. Now that we're segueing to the topic for tonight, you've given this workshop for our church's summer camp this past summer, and you were one of 5, and yours was particularly pertaining to why the resurrection was a real event.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, or actually, I guess it's a two-parter. First of all, what does the resurrection mean to you? The resurrection of Jesus mean to you? And then the second part to that question would be, how did this workshop come to be? Like, how did the Spirit lead you? Why is this so near and dear to your heart to also present it to the campers, right?
Yeah. To answer the first question, right, what the resurrection means to me. Well, growing up as a Christian, right, raised in a Christian family, going to church, all that jazz, right? Looking into this, I mean, to be fair, my conversion, my coming to faith was a supernatural event that I cannot explain. I can't like use that as, I'm not going to use that as proof that like God is real or anything like that. It's a personal anecdote. It's something that was real for me. But when it comes to like actually looking at the resurrection event, it's a vindication, I would say, not only of like Jesus's claims as himself, about himself, right? Obviously the resurrection is a vindication of that. But when it comes, from my point of view, it's a vindication of like everything that I was taught as a kid, that like I wasn't just taught like these sacred traditions and like, you know, like this is just something that we do every Sunday, or this is just something that like, oh yeah, make sure you pray before you eat, pray before you go to sleep and stuff like this. Is not, these aren't just like mental exercises, I guess, or whatever, right? These aren't just like ritualistic practices that we just do just because, right? That all these things that we do that are features of Christianity, they are actually like intrinsic to Christian practice, right? It's like this is what we do as Christians, and that like the resurrection to me is like, yeah, vindicating everything that was taught as a kid. It was just like, oh, like not only am I kind of like vindicating my supernatural conversion, but it's showing that like, wow, like there really is a reasonable, it is reasonable to believe in Christianity, in the central claim of Christianity, which is that Jesus rose from the dead. That is the central unique claim of Christianity. Every religion has its own unique claims about itself. You know, but for Christianity, it's that Jesus rose from the dead. And like me looking into that over the years and like looking at the strong evidence that points to the resurrection being a real event, it's like, wow, like this is something that actually happened. You know, this is a real event, just as I'll mention later, Alexander the Great conquering like much of Europe, or just as real as, you know, the attack on Pearl Harbor or the building of the Great Wall of China. Like any of these historical events that we know to be true, it's like the resurrection is just as real as that. Like that's a real historical event. And then to answer the second question of how this came to be, I actually gave this one presentation, right, was actually split into two originally. In my communications class in college, right, we were assigned at the beginning of the semester. We were assigned 4 speeches. I think it was 4. Each one increasing in length and and they were set to accomplish different things. The last 2 speeches were the longest ones. The informative speech and the persuasive speech. The informative speech was simply just like an 8 to 10 minute speech about, or I think it was like 6 to 8 minutes of a topic they researched, and it wasn't trying to argue one way or the other. It was presenting information, and the audience can do what they want with that information. It's just you're just presenting information. That's all, hence the name informative speech. The last one was the persuasive speech, which was you research a topic and you present a thesis, and your goal is to try to like present a persuasive argument in favor of that thesis. It wasn't, you weren't actually trying to convince anyone, but like the like in the audience that you're speaking to, because we literally had to give the speech during class. Obviously, it's a communications class. But you know, the goal is to present a persuasive argument, essentially, right? And for those last 2 speeches, I decided to make them connected. Obviously, you didn't have to; they could have been like completely unrelated. All 4 speeches for the class could have been unrelated, but I decided to make it a 2-part thing, where the first, for the informative speech, was establishing New Testament reliability. So I gave an informative speech, like, here's the information about like how we know other things about history to be true. Like how we know anything about the Roman Empire, right? How we know anything, right? By those same standards, we know we can rely on the gospel, the 4 gospels that we find in the New Testament, right? And then for my persuasive speech, which again I connected to the informative speech, which was on the resurrection itself. I built that case upon the New Testament reliability. Like the way I started out that my persuasive speech too is that like I was like, okay, like based on what we know, I get, like, you know, a couple weeks ago I gave the speech on the New Testament and why we can rely on it as historical documents, right? Because we know that, or based on that assumption, does its claim, do the Gospels, how can we conclude about their claim? What can we conclude about their claims about the resurrection? And so in my persuasive speech, I gave a presentation on why the resurrection was a real event, and then like in the persuasive speech, you also had to give a policy, right? Policy prescription for like a person or a government or anyone to adopt, right? That was your thesis. Your thesis is X should accept Y, right? So I was like, okay, the rubric and the outline for the requirements for the presentation are pretty lax. So it doesn't specifically say that it has to be a governmental policy, right? So I was like, okay, I'm going to make this an individual one then. My individual policy that I want people to adopt, that I'm arguing for, is that they should accept the gospel to be saved. And I quoted, I think it was Acts 16:31. I think that was my thesis statement. That was the policy proposal that I was accepting, that believe in Jesus Christ and you'll be saved. And so I was like, yeah, so I'm going to give a presentation. That's my policy prescription. And this is the research that I'm presenting that to show why it's reasonable to believe that Jesus really rose from the dead. And, and then fast forward, I don't know. I don't remember how long into the future, but prior to summer camp earlier this year, right? Kuya Allen was like, we need workshop speakers, and I was thinking that you could be one of them, and I was thinking like, you know, in my head, I was like, man, I've always wanted to do a workshop. Even when I was still a camper, like not even a leader, like straight up a camper.
Mhm.
I was still a teenager and all that. And it's just, I was like, one day I want to do a workshop. And this was really an answered prayer of mine because like years prior to even being approached about this, I've been wanting this. And then Queen Allen just comes up to me. He's like, hey, he texts me, hey, yeah, we need workshop speaker. Ask around. And also I want you to do one of them if you're led. And I was like, man, I just gave a speech about the resurrection. I think I really want to do this. I was like, yeah, I already have a topic in mind. I actually have a presentation ready. I just need to like adapt them because I gave slide presentations for my informative and persuasive speeches. I just needed to combine the two into one so that like, you know, everything coheres and flows nicely. I was like, yeah, just I'll give you the outline. I have a slide presentation ready. I so want to do this. And so, yeah, I gave, so at summer camp, come July of this year, you know, I have the workshop ready and I'm like, I'm so down for this. And it led to, me giving a presentation on this topic. And like, as a history buff, like I really love history. Like, you know, it's really important to learn about your history, especially the history of Christianity, the history of the church and stuff like that. But also because of the setting that I was in summer camp, right? I really had a burden of like, people are going to a Christian camp, but I really think that people should like at least have in the back of their minds the basics. Like, why are they even at a Christian camp in the first place? Like, what are we all doing here if Christianity isn't true, right? And I actually made that clear in my presentation, which I was going to get to too in my slide presentation. But like, yeah, like I really felt a burden of like showing people that we're not just here to have like to play field games and, you know, share cabins together and then, you know, have team time or whatever, right? And any secular camp can do that, right? But the reason why we're here is because we're united as believers, or you're a friend of someone who's a believer and we want to reach out to you. So yeah, I was like, okay, I need to make a presentation that is catered to making sure that people who are believers understand why belief is actually rational and why the resurrection really happened, and on the other side of that, if they're not saved, right, present again why like Christianity is true, why it's not irrational or it's like this like esoteric, ethereal, like woo-woo magic thingy that of like, oh yeah, we just pray to a magic sky daddy and stuff like that. Like, no, this is a belief system based on a real event. So that was where my burden was, and I was like, everything just clicked into place of giving the presentation, the two presentations in college, and then being approached about to give a workshop, and I was like, okay, like everything is coming together where this is exactly what I want to do. So yeah.
With that, judges, can you to formally segue to the introduction, right? Before could you please read 1 Corinthians 15, 3-4? Yeah. And then I think I really believe that'll be not like the best segue to posing the questions too in your introduction.
Yeah. I mean, I obviously like have the verse memorized, but I don't want to like accidentally misword it, you know. You said 3-4? Yeah, so Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, right? In verses 3-4, he says, "For I delivered to you first of all that which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures." And that is the essence of the gospel. That is the central claim of Christianity. That not only did Jesus claim to be the Messiah, not only did he claim to be the one to bear our sins, that he claimed to die and then later rise again from the dead. He actually did those things. He actually did die, and he was buried, and then he rose again, and he was actually seen. He was seen post-mortem after death. So, and we're about to go through why like this is a reasonable thing to believe. With that, I guess I'll start the So this is my slide presentation for summer camp. As you can see, I didn't change the little subtitle there, Residence 24. I still felt that it was poignant and relevant here. But yeah, and it's slow, but but yeah. When I gave this presentation, I was like, why do we even need to talk about this? We're at a Christian camp. We're all believers, or at least like we're tangentially associated with believers. Yeah, like why is this even an important topic to talk about? Like, but and especially like for us too, like you and I are believers, so like why should we talk about this kind of topic? And Paul himself, right? Apostle Paul, he said later on in 1 Corinthians 15, the same chapter of like where he outlines the gospel, he says that our entire faith rests upon whether or not Jesus actually rose from the dead. If he is not risen, it says here in verse 14 of chapter 15, if Christ is not risen, then our preaching is empty and your faith is also empty. Right? It says later on in verse 17, if Christ is not risen, your faith is futile and you're still in your sins. So yeah, he like Paul says it in clear words that like our entire reason for being at a Christian camp or here in this church right now, our entire reason for even doing that rests upon whether or not Jesus actually rose from the dead. So while we may take it for granted that like, oh yeah, we grew up in a Christian church where, you know, we're friends with Christians who believe that Jesus rose from the dead and stuff like that, whatever, right? We may take that for granted. No, let's not take that for granted, because like if we are, if none of that is true, then we're most to be pitied, right? It's like we've wasted our time. We are deluded. At worst, we're lying. But either way, we're just like we're still our whole faith, our whole life is pointless, because it's like, well, like we're living for something that isn't true. Yeah, and let's not take our faith for granted. We have to like look at like at least once in our life, right? We should at least look at the central claim of Christianity and look at it. Is it true, right? And like not just that, like, and it's not just a burden for evangelism, or not evangelism, for your own edification, but also evangelism, right? And apologetics, right? 1 Peter 3:15, right? Always be ready to give a defense for the hope that is in you, right? And obviously with gentleness and respect, as verse 15 says, right? And Acts 17:11, right? Where the Bereans, right? Oh, yeah. They didn't just like take Paul's word like as it was, right? Put it fine because Paul was right. But the Bereans were just like, you know, let's actually search the scriptures to see if it was true. And they did. And Paul commended them for that. He said like that was an admirable thing for them to do. So yeah, and that is also my burden of like not just so personal edification and evangelism and apologetics, right? Like look to see if these things are true. It will strengthen your faith and it will help you give a defense for why you believe what you believe. Yeah. So yeah, that's I feel like that was my burden for why I was really led to share this topic and why we even need to talk about this, right? And let's see. Yeah, and like what we read, right? In what you had me read in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-4, it says that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, right? Specifically the scriptures right here. And it says it again in verse 4, right? And we're going to look at that, right? We're going to look at what they mean by what Paul means by the scriptures, because he keeps saying that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. According to the scriptures, what is he talking about? He's talking about the manuscripts that were written down about the accounts of the resurrection, which were the Gospels, right? And so we're going to look at those manuscripts, and manuscript just means handwritten documents, right? Manuscript, hand, script, written, so handwritten documents. And yeah, we're going to look at that and look at how, based on the real world standards of something called textual criticism, right? And and like, this is just a slide presentation, like what even is the New Testament, right? And like, is it a bunch of fortune cookie sayings? Is it a bunch of empty platitudes? No, it's the New Testament and the Gospels, right? Specifically, they're not just like fortune cookie books. They're not just like, wise sayings of like today's astrology or something, right? I don't know, right? We need to look at the Gospels and the New Testament as a whole as historical documents. Treat them as such, right? Where even just for the sake of argument, just treat them as this normal historical documents that you normally would, just a regular report from a Roman soldier or something, right? Just treat it as if it was just the diary of a Roman soldier, or some grocery list from some Greek merchant, right? Just treat it as that. And we go through something called textual criticism, which is the process of trying to find out the meaning of the original meaning of a text through looking at the different manuscripts, right? And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the different manuscripts that were available at the time, and look at how, as I mentioned earlier before I cut myself off, that like how even based on the standards that we use for secular pieces of antiquity, other documents, right? Based on those standards, you can fully rely on the Gospels and the New Testament as a whole. Like, there shouldn't be this double standard of like, okay, we can trust everything that it says about Alexander the Great, or about the Roman emperors, or about Genghis Khan, or about any of the Japanese shogun, right? But all of a sudden, like, no, we have to treat the Gospels as there's
these, like a different, somehow they're held to a different standard.
It's somehow held to a different and like unfair standard, really, because it's like, well, treat them as how they were intended to be received, which were the Gospels. The Gospels specifically were written as eyewitness accounts, or ghost written by a first-hand account, right? So so we'll look at textual criticism, right? And we'll go through different proofs, or not proofs, I don't really like to use that word, but evidences for New Testament reliability, right? Like, for example, the sheer number of manuscripts that exist about the Gospels, right? Of the Gospels, and when these writings were written, archaeological verification that corroborates what the Gospel accounts say, and extra biblical corroboration, meaning sources outside of the Bible that were written around the same time that also corroborate the claims of the New Testament. So extra biblical corroboration and archaeological verification, they go hand in hand. Well, yeah, let's look at the number of manuscripts, right? So when we talk about, Julius Caesar, the guy who got stabbed like 23 times in the Senate, right? All we have about on his writings and stuff, and stuff about him, we have 10 manuscripts of him, right? We have 10 manuscripts. That's not a lot. It doesn't sound like a lot from our standards, and from historical standards, that really is not a lot.
And yet we consider it,
yes, right,
to be historical.
Exactly. Like, we don't question the historicity of like Julius Caesar's writings, or writings about Julius Caesar, or Tacitus, Roman historian, right? We have stuff. We have 20 manuscripts of stuff that he wrote down, and he's considered to be a reliable Roman historian. Like, I have no problem with that, but it's just like, if we're going to do that, then like, why would we not do the same with the New Testament? Because we'll just wait until we get into Testament, right? 20 manuscripts is not a lot. Still not a lot. Homer's Iliad, right? Fictional work, right? But textual criticism is still used even on fictional works because, you know, it was a handwritten story, and it was a widely written story that was there was a story that was widely distributed, and so and they didn't have a printing press, right? So they had to manually write down copies, and you know, do all these things, and make sure that there weren't any discrepancies between each copy, because you know, you want to preserve Homer's writings as much as you can. And I will admit that the number of manuscripts is much more impressive than the previous two that I mentioned, right? There are about 1,800 manuscripts. And that's a lot. That by historical standards, that 1,800 manuscripts is a lot for by historical standards. That's a lot for using textual criticism and looking at which one is a human error in copying, which one is clearly just a forgery and stuff like that. The more copies you have, the better it is to actually look at what the text originally said. And that's the purpose of textual criticism. And again, 1,800 is a lot, but we look at the New Testament. That thing in the Greek language alone has 5,000 manuscripts just in that language alone, and that's more than double, almost 3 times the number of manuscripts of Homer's Iliad, right? And that's just in the Greek language alone. If we take into account the different other languages that the New Testament was translated into, like Latin, Syriac, Coptic, even Arabic, right? We have 20,000 copies. 20,000 copies, handwritten copies. And again, using textual criticism, we look at these individual copies, and they're all saying the same thing with barely any differences in between. And we'll get to those differences because there are differences. But the beauty of textual criticism is that you can because so many of these manuscripts say the same thing. When something says something radically different, even if it's contemporary, even if it claims to be a manuscript about the topic at hand, right? If it's so wildly different, even in a sentence or two or in a paragraph, right? If it says something that no other manuscript says, we know that this is a forgery, or this is just someone adding a little scribble in the margin, and then someone an archaeologist is thinking that was part of it. They added that to part of the text. But you know, again, the beauty of textual criticism is that we can see the outliers, and they are outliers. The differences that exist are outliers, and we just reject them as inauthentic. They're not authentic, and the manuscripts that we have that are considered authentic because they're all uniformly saying the same thing. We can trust that the New Testament that we have today in our Bible is still the original, right? And yeah, what about these differences, right? Let's take, for example, the gospel accounts of who was at the empty tomb, right? And there are differences, right? And for example, in Luke, he says that there's a group of women who went to the empty tomb, right? He doesn't say who was there. He didn't say how many. He just says that, a group of women. Mark says that 3 women were there: Mary Magdalene, Mary Mother of Jesus, and a woman named Salome, right? So he names them. Matthew says that he only says that Mary Magdalene and Mary Mother of Jesus were there. These are 3 different accounts, and they say 3 different things. One says a group of women, 2 of them name the women, but they name different ones. Are these contradictory? Clearly not, because that's how that works. Each gospel, they were written for different purposes. right? That's why we have 4 gospels, is that each author was trying to accomplish a different task. They were writing to different audiences. And because of that, they emphasize different details, right? And that's the nature of the differences between the gospels and the manuscripts, right? And when it comes to like other error, like not even errors, because there are errors in manuscripts because they're handwritten copies, they didn't have printing press. It really is just like not dotting an I, not crossing a T, punctuation,
or just
grammatical
like
errors.
a letter
Yes,
too, right?
yeah, right. But none of the 20,000 manuscripts that we have of the New Testament in every language that exists out there, none of them say anything that actually harms the core doctrines of Christianity. None of them say anything so radically different that it's just like, oh, what even is true Christianity? Or like, what about all these different books that aren't even included in the Bible, which we'll get to? It's the gospel accounts, they don't contradict each other. They provide different details and complementary details. And the manuscripts that we have of the 20,000, when we find a difference, it's so minuscule that whenever there's a major difference, we just toss it out. It's not authentic. Yeah, and these are complementary details, not contradictions, as like atheists and Muslims and other critics of Christianity would like to say. They flow nicely together. We go to like when these gospels are written, right? Because Paul was talking about according to the scriptures, right? Again, in 1 Corinthians 15, he kept saying according to the scriptures, which means that these things are already being in circulation during that time. Now, 1 Corinthians was dated what, like 70 AD max? I think it's even 40 AD.
Yeah.
Right?
It's really...
Yeah, really, really early. And when was Jesus crucified? Around 33 AD. So we're talking like 7 years maximum, like of when... Meaning that these guys are still alive. None of them have been persecuted or executed yet. They are still writing these things down and circulating them. Before Paul even writes 1 Corinthians, right? So, yeah, the Gospels, the most liberal estimate is 70 AD, right? Which is 40 years after the events of the resurrection. That seems like a long time, but like when we look at for 1 Corinthians, written within a decade, could have been written within a decade of the crucifixion. Like 40, like we said, 40 AD. But when we look at other works of antiquity, right? When we look at when other things were written, like, oh man, 40 years, 70 years. Let's even go with 70 years, right? Let's just pretend that all the Gospels and Paul's letters to the Corinthians, they were all written at least 70 AD. Let's grant that. Fine. Seems like a long time. Still within the lifetime of the apostles, but fine. Let's give it the highest estimate. The writings of Tacitus, the Roman historian Tacitus, on his accounts of the Roman Emperor Tiberius Caesar, right? The earliest account that he wrote about Tiberius Caesar, 80 years after the death of Tiberius Caesar. 80 years. That's the earliest account of what we have. So imagine, like, you know, like you passed away, and then 80 years later, that's when someone decides to write about your life. And we're gonna, like, never met you, but we're just gonna trust that person knows everything about your life, and they're gonna write like things about you, and we're just gonna take it at face value. 80 years. Now it gets even worse. Alexander the Great, right? Learned about him. Did you learn about him in middle school? Because I think I did in middle school.
I think briefly in middle school. And
yes,
it's a bit more in high school.
Yeah, I think I learned more about it in middle school than in high school. We barely learned about it in high school, but we learned about him in public school system. I mean, for me, and then for you, I'm not like you learned about him when you were in school, but like regardless, no one really questions the historicity of the things that Alexander the Great did. It's just he conquered much of Europe. He came from Macedonia. All these different things. He died at a young age. He was very, very pagan. All these things, right? And our earliest account of him, the single earliest account, that we have about Alexander the Great was written 300 years after his death. 300 years. That's not even within 3 lifetimes of his right? That's not even within 3 lifetimes. So the fact that in the modern school systems, whether it's public or private, anything like that, right? Whenever we learn about Alexander the Great, we don't question it because it's like, oh yeah, okay, it's a thing that happened. But like, our earliest account was 300 years after his death, and yet we won't take the gospel accounts which were written within a decade of the events that they're writing about. That this is the double standard that I was talking about, right? Of like how we'll take the historical accounts of other events and we'll just like take it face value, like whatever, right? But for some reason, when it comes to the Gospels and the Bible as a whole, it's like, oh no, we can't trust that, even though it's written earlier. Like these were literally eyewitness accounts. It's like, no, we just gotta explain it away. Yeah. What about other works of antiquity, right? That make claims about Jesus, right? For example, like in the Da Vinci Code, the movie with Tom Hanks and stuff, and the book by Dan Brown, I think it is. The Gospel of Thomas was rejected from the Bible because of some like Roman Catholic conspiracy or whatever. And it's like, that's no, like that's not even close. It's like, oh yeah, like it elucidates so many different details that the Catholic Church tried to suppress or whatever. Like the Catholic Church did a lot of things. That was not one of them. There was not this like vast conspiracy to like suppress different gospels that were supposed to be in the Bible but weren't. First off, that completely misunderstands how we even got our canon, which we explained in a previous episode, right? Because that's not how we established canon. But also, like, just again, by the standard of like looking when things were written, looking at when things were written compared to the events that they're claiming about. The Gospel of Thomas is a Gnostic forgery that was written 2nd or 3rd century, meaning like 2nd century is like from the year 100 to 200, or 3rd century is 200 to 300. Like, so we're talking like at least 100 years after the events of the resurrection. And if you actually look at the Gospel of Thomas, you actually read it, right? Which you can like look up a PDF online. Not that hard to find. You look at it and you look at like John's Gospel or the Synoptic Gospels, and it's so clearly different in terms of like not even just writing style, right? Because everyone had their different writing styles, but in terms of content, like it's so radically different from what you would expect in something that would be contemporaneous to the events. And it's so obvious that it's like some Gnostic philosophical jargon and nonsense that people are trying to mix with Christian elements. And like, you know, they never corroborated it with an apostle or a successor to an apostle, which I hesitate to use that term because apostolic succession is a different topic altogether. But someone related to the apostles or anything like that, right? Like, they only attached the name Thomas to the gospel because the Gnostics, they wanted to like appeal to Christian figures in order to like get more converts. But they were not converting people to Christianity. They were converting people to Gnosticism or Christian Gnosticism, which is an oxymoron if you ask me. But yeah, it's not contemporaneous. It's not authentic. It's clearly a forgery. It's just Gnostic nonsense that tries to pull Christian elements into it to make it sound more appealing to Christians, but it's not authentic. Like it's not even within the same ballpark in terms of time frame of the Gospels. The Da Vinci Code. Oh, it is by Dan Brown. Or the Quran, right? The Quran also makes claims about Jesus. Also, funny because my notebook looks a lot like a Quran, but it's not. I swear, it's a notebook. But yeah, the Quran makes claims about Jesus about like it's funny because it affirms Jesus as being born of a virgin, born of the Virgin Mary, performing miracles. It even calls him the Word of God, and it claims him to be the Messiah. Now, the Quran doesn't even know what those mean, because if they did, then they would not like affirm those about him. Because also in the Quran, not despite calling him the Word of God and the Messiah, right, which we as Christians know are divine claims.
Mm-hmm.
The Quran claims that, oh yeah, Jesus was just merely a prophet, merely a human, good teacher, good moral example. That's it. And also, he was never crucified. A lookalike was replaced him, and that lookalike, some Muslims theorize that as Judas, but he was never crucified. A lookalike was crucified in his place, and he was assumed into heaven. Only one source claims that in the history of historical documents about anything related to Jesus, anything, only one source claims that, and that's the Quran. And the Quran was compiled in the 7th century. It was revealed in the 7th century, 600 something AD.
Mm-hmm.
600 years removed from the events of the resurrection. So we're going to take the word of a 7th century illiterate caravan robber over the eyewitness accounts of the people who actually were there. Again, like with the Debunking and the Gospel of Thomas, this is my rebuke towards atheists and other Christian critics of Christianity. And then like obviously the Quran, it's like an indictment against Muslims, is that like, you know, you're making me you want me to believe in accounts that were written far after the events of the people who were actually there. You ask me, I'm going to take the accounts of the people who were actually there, because at least these were written at least within the lifetime of the apostles. So if there was ever a forgery, even during the time of the apostles, they would have called them out. We would have like rooted them out a long time ago. If the Gospel of Thomas was not a 2nd century or 3rd century forgery and was written like actually among the time of the apostles, but still contained the same content. Let's say it contained the same content, but it was written during the time of the apostles would be like, that didn't happen. No. What are you talking about? Jesus never said that. He never he never made clay birds and then breathed into them and then gave life to them, which is, by the way, what the Quran claims. By the way, the Quran got that from the Gospel of Thomas, but it didn't know that. So it's pretty funny, the fact that it had listened to a fictional story, thought it was real, and then attributed it to Jesus. But it's just I'm not going to take the claims of the Gospel of Thomas or the Quran, because again, like with the Gospel of Thomas, it's like, even if it was written during the time of the apostles, or any other forgery, right? Any other forgery written during the time of the apostles, any one of them would just been like, that's not true. Or if Thomas himself saw that this was being attributed to him, he's like, I never said this, I never wrote this. Immediately dissociated with them. Like there's no reason for them to like accept that as part of the canon, right? Yeah. Let's look at like were these manuscripts actually recorded? Because it's like we can look at how many manuscripts there are, and when they were written, but can we actually trust that each handwritten copy were accurately recorded, right? Mm-hmm. Well, like when we take into consideration the Jewish tradition of copying manuscripts of the Old Testament, for example, right? Mm-hmm. They were very meticulous about writing things down under penalty of like death. They honestly thought that their lives were on the line if they ever made a mistake in terms of writing down handwriting copies of their manuscripts, of their scriptures, right? When we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, right, were discovered in the 1940s in the Dead Sea, in Israel, we find that they were actually written. The Dead Sea Scrolls date around 300 BC to about 100 AD, like within that time frame, right? 300 BC, so even before Jesus' time. And even to well into the 1st century, it contains much of the Old Testament, like a lot of Isaiah, right? it contains a lot of that. And we look at it, and it contains, and it's like virtually identical to the Old Testament that we have today.
Mhm.
Just look at the sections that have Isaiah, the portions of the Dead Sea Scrolls that have Isaiah, and it's basically word for word what we have. So, and then we combine that with the fact that most early converts to Christianity were formerly Jews, right? And so, and they very much held to these traditions of copying. And remember, Paul himself was a high-ranking Pharisee. He was going to be the Pharisee of Pharisees, and he's very well educated, and so he's well aware of these practices. And he got quite a number of Jewish converts to Christianity who maintain these traditions. So if we were able to like see that the Old Testament is like so like word for word identical to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which have those Jewish traditions of handwriting copies, it's not unreasonable to maintain that sort of that line of reasoning with the copying of the New Testament scriptures, because there'd be no reason for them to like suddenly ditch that tradition of meticulously, painstakingly copying each individual document. Whatever, right? It's just they're so alike that it's you'd be hard pressed to find something that like just drastically fundamentally changes Jewish or Christian belief. You're just not going to find it. And so, like, if the Old Testament was accurately recorded by these traditions, then we can trust that the New Testament scriptures were accurately recorded in that same way with those same traditions. And when we look at archaeological verification, right? The Quirinius inscription, right? I don't remember how far this dates back, but it actually, you know how Jesus was born in a manger, born in Bethlehem, all that jazz, right?
Yeah.
The whole reason why they were there, right, was because of a census, right? They needed to go back to Joseph's hometown in order to be counted for the census. The Quirinius inscription literally outlines that exact census that made them go to Bethlehem. Or you look at the Pontius Pilate stone, right? Pontius Pilate was a real figure. It's not like they just made up some character or whatever, and like, you know, some, like, he was a Roman prefect, and he was a governor, and like, you know, he executed Jesus. Like, no, he was a real guy. Like, there are archaeological proofs of Pontius Pilate's existence, of what he did, who he was, and stuff like that. And the Pontius Pilate stone is just just a portion of that. And we look at Luke's gospel as well, right? Luke's gospel actually like accurately portrays Roman culture and practices and even legal procedures. Like, even as like Jesus was being led to being put on trial by Pontius himself, the details of the crucifixion and like him being led there and stuff like that, and all that stuff, right? What we know about Roman culture and legal practices, right? Luke accurately records that. He accurately talks about. He describes that. He describes Jesus's trial and stuff, and that against a Roman backdrop. He does it in a very accurate way. And we look at extra biblical corroboration, right? And all of these are either like first or early 2nd century, right? Which is not that far removed, because even in the 2nd century sources, right, they are connected to the 1st century sources, right? For example, in the 1st century, we have Clement of Rome, we have Ignatius of Antioch over here in the middle right here. Ignatius, we have Josephus in Rome, right? We have Josephus in Rome, first century Jewish historian, right?
Mhm.
He wrote about Jesus in his writings about history. He didn't believe that he was the Messiah or anything, because again, he was a Jewish historian.
Mhm.
But he was like, yeah, there's these guys over there in Jerusalem. They're like talking about this Messiah figure, or whatever, and like they're claiming that he's doing all these miracles. He attributed it to black magic. But he's just like, yeah, no, like there are these accounts of these things that are going on, and like so he definitely, like, even a non-believer of Christianity, a Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, even he was like, yeah, no, like these guys are, yeah, they really did crucify this Jesus guy. Again, he thought that he deserved it, but you know, but it, like, and even modern scholars today, right? Critical scholars, by the way, like Gerd Ludemann, right? Gerd Ludemann, he's an atheist. He does not believe in Christianity, but he says that the crucifixion itself is indisputable. Or John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg, right? Both of them are part of something called the Jesus Seminar, which it's not a Jesus friendly seminar. It's really a critical organization that's trying to debunk Christian claims about the Gospels and stuff, and they're trying to like rewrite history essentially, or reinterpret what we know about the Gospels. But even they say that, again, like there's not the slightest doubt about the fact that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and Marcus Borg, this guy right here, and he said that Jesus' death by execution is the most certain fact. Or Pinchas Lapid, a Jewish historian, or Paula Fredrickson, a convert to Judaism, right? Also a historian. Historically, they both say it's historically certain. Paula Fredrickson herself says that the single most solid fact about Jesus' life is his death. He was executed by Pontius Pilate on or around Passover by crucifixion, which was an execution that was particularly reserved for political insurrectionists. And remember, like, Jesus was accused of being a political insurrectionist, right? So, and all these scholars agree, yeah, Jesus was, like, he definitely died. This actually happened. The Gospels are correct in claiming that Jesus actually existed, because there are Jesus myths out there, but they're kind of laughed out of the room even amongst atheist historians. But like, not only did he exist, he actually died. He really did die on the cross. He really was executed under Pontius Pilate. And and there's this infamous atheist historian, Bart Ehrman, right? He also says that one of the most certain facts of history is Jesus' crucifixion, right? All of these modern scholars, none of them Christians, none of these guys are Christians, believe in Christianity, but they agree that Jesus really did exist. Jesus really did die on the cross. But the important question is, did he stay dead, or did he rise after death, right? Because again, the central claim of Christianity is that Jesus rose from the dead, right? And if we're looking at the Gospels, right, it's like we already know what the conclusion they came to, right? Of like, like we see him after death, right? How do we explain this? But let's review the facts of what we know from the Gospels and see what kind of theory best fits the facts that we know, right? Because if even the atheists and Jewish critics of Christianity acknowledge these facts that I'm about to lay out, then there's only one logical conclusion that you can come to when you look at these facts, right? For example, that again, Jesus died by crucifixion and that he was buried, right? These are facts that we know, that even atheists agree with. That his tomb was discovered empty, right? It was at least discovered empty.
Mhm.
And that multiple people across different periods of time in different places saw him after he apparently died, after he supposedly died.
Yeah.
So how do we explain? And by the way, many of these people that claim to have seen him died still believing that they saw him.
Yeah.
And they still proclaim to have seen him after they didn't retract their statements, right?
Mhm.
But how do we explain these facts about the that the Gospels claim that, again, even the atheists and Jewish critics of Christianity will still admit to? They all admit these facts.
Mhm.
How do we explain it? Now, there's a number of naturalistic explanations, meaning like if you automatically, before even entering the discussion, you only assume a naturalistic explanation, right? Then there's only like a couple of different theories they can go with, right? Yeah, you have to assume that there's a naturalistic explanation, that nothing supernatural is involved, right? You have to assume that.
Presupposition.
Yes,
already.
that's your presupposition, right? But the whole point of the central claim of Christianity is that there was something supernatural involved, right? So it is a complete mistake, an epistemological mistake, meaning like a mistake in your way of thinking, to automatically assume that nothing supernatural is involved and automatically assume that only something naturalistic can explain these facts. And
I mean, even dealing with
Yeah.
the question of the resurrection, that's already something so unnaturalistic.
Yes.
Because
the whole point,
there's literally,
yeah,
I mean, I'm sure there's other mythos and fantasy tales about people rising from the dead, but in terms of historicity and like reliability of historical and eyewitness accounts, there's really only one that stands out and has stood the test of time, which is the resurrection of Christ, right? That is the importance, not only just the foundation of our faith, but it goes back to your point of like, you can't come to a naturalistic conclusion or even presupposition because you're dealing with even the word resurrection. How is that naturalistic for a person who died to rise again? That just goes to the point that what if Jesus was more than a man, which goes to his godhood, right? 100% man, but also 100% God. And if he wasn't God, then how can his claims be divine too?
Yeah,
right?
exactly. But he, the whole time, remember, when he was alive, he was claiming to be God. He was making claims about himself that only God can make.
Yeah.
He didn't explicitly say, "I am God, I am God, I'm God, worship me," like how Muslims try to point it out to be. But no, like he made it clear that he was only acting upon God's authority, God the Father. And he was claiming to be the Son of God and God himself. So, like, obviously there would have to be something supernatural involved, right?
Yeah.
But let's just throw it out the window and let's just go with only the naturalistic explanation. And we'll see that even if they can satisfy some of the facts that we just explained earlier, they will not explain all of them. And you have to explain all of them in order to be a satisfying theory, because these are the facts that we know. If you're a theory that's trying to satisfy these 4 facts about what the Gospels are claiming, you need to explain all of them. Otherwise, like there's by definition a hole in your theory, and therefore we can't trust what you're trying to claim about it. But the naturalistic explanations are the legend theory, the idea that like, oh yeah, this is just something that this was just a myth that developed over time, and it was propagated at the Council of Nicaea or whatever, right? That Jesus, whatever, some nonsense, right? We'll go over that. Or the hallucination theory, the idea that like, oh, the apostles and the other witnesses, they just hallucinated seeing him. They're so grief stricken. Or that Jesus somehow survived crucifixion, right? As if, right? Or the conspiracy theory that like the disciples, they came together and hashed this plot to make it look like Jesus rose from the dead and like start a political movement to try to like overthrow the Roman government or whatever. Because again, that's what Peter wanted to do. And other apostles, they were like, yeah, no, like this is our political Messiah. We need to, like, right. This is a theory that they just made it make it seem like Jesus rose from the dead. But again, we're gonna like go through each one and like just completely debunk these and talk about how like they just do not satisfy the facts whatsoever, right? And starting with the legend theory, right? The claim is that the whole idea that Jesus rose from the dead, it's a legend or a myth that developed over time, right? Like I said, right? But there's a number of problems with this theory, right? We know that the resurrection was a belief that the apostles had from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. Again, look back at 1 Corinthians, look back at the Gospels. Written 40 AD. 40 AD is literally 7 years after the crucifixion and the resurrection. Like, this is clearly not something that came about over time. Like, come on. Like, the idea that this was just like only propagated by the Catholic Church or something, or only probably just developed over time at the Council of Nicaea, that's nonsense. This is something that they held from the very beginning. And we look at how the Apostles' Creed was formulated, which again, the Apostles' Creed is found in 1 Corinthians 15. That thing is the Apostles' Creed. And again, we just went over how early that was written. So obviously it's not a legendary development. All right. Or the idea that Jesus never actually rose from the dead, but they just appeared to them that it was so, right? Like, oh, they were so grief stricken that they simply imagined Jesus after he died. Like, oh my gosh, like I miss him so much. Oh, is that him? Is that him? Is that gardener him? Is that the gardener? Like, oh, it's like, come on. Like, first off, if you're ever in doubt of someone's death, open the tomb. Literally just open the tomb.
It was empty.
Exactly, right? That was the other fact that I just mentioned earlier, right? It was found empty. So, like, no, this, like, it doesn't even pass the smell test. Like, it's just open the tomb. And like, also, you just fundamentally misunderstand how hallucinations work. They cannot be shared.
Yeah.
You can't share hallucinations. If we both did acid or like mushrooms or something, right? We are not going to see the same things.
Exactly.
And even if we did, there's an element of suggestibility. Yeah. Of like, you see the leprechaun over there? Oh yeah, I totally see the leprechaun over there. Even though, like, you didn't see it originally. It's just you found something that you were already looking for. But they're not looking for that. And like they cannot create new ideas, right? That they had no concept of, like bodily resurrection, right? The Jews of the time, they had a concept of a resurrection after the dead during the end times, right? But they didn't think that they would happen before the end times. So when Jesus was claiming that he would rise from the dead, they were like, wait, that's not even the end times yet. Like, there's no way that would happen, because God himself said that, like, this only happen in the end times. So they had no concept of a pre-end times bodily resurrection. And so, like, them hallucinating something that they had no concept of is just not possible. It's like trying to imagine a new color. That is not possible. You have no concept of a new color because it just doesn't exist in your mind. There's no way to hallucinate that. Yeah. So, yeah, hallucinations, they can't create new ideas, especially ones that you had no prior concept of, and they cannot be shared, because that's just not how hallucinations work. And hallucinations, they don't lead to you suddenly completely going in the other direction in terms of ideology and in terms of theology, and just so convincingly that, like, you just completely abandon what your life was before. Because again, take the example of Paul. He was going to be the Pharisee of Pharisees. He was actively persecuting Christians, actively murdering them. He was holding people's coats as people went to go stone Christians. And all of a sudden, he just made that complete 180 to the point where, like, he was like, I would give up my own salvation if it meant to the salvation of my Jewish brethren. Yeah. He went from, I'm going to murder Christians for the sake of, like, upholding Jewish tradition and Jewish sanctity, to, I would give up my own salvation for the salvation of my Jewish brethren. Yeah. If only they would believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Like, all based on a hallucination? And he wrote most of the New Testament under what authority if he was hallucinating? Like, exactly. Hallucinations do not make you do that. Like, you will be deluded for a time, but hallucinations wear off, and they do not lead to such a 180 and a lifelong, by the way. He went to his death in that 180 direction, right? And again, he had a huge theological shift. He never believed that Jesus was the Messiah. until he appeared to him. And it's just like, well, I have to change my ways. I have to change my mind. And you would have to claim that Paul was mentally ill, that he was hallucinatory in both audio and visually, and have this like sort of like magnanimous sort of ego in order to think that he would have this authority to write most of the New Testament. Like that's a whole can of worms. That's a whole theory that you need to prove. All those different elements to prove that like Paul was insane when he claimed to have seen the Messiah. And that's just Paul alone when it comes, and he wrote most of the New Testament again. But what's more reasonable, to think that he actually saw a risen Christ, or that he was all these things that you can't prove, by the way? You can't prove that he was mentally ill. You can't prove that he was hallucinating both auditorily and visually. And you can't prove that he had a massive ego. Like, these are things that you have to claim and assume, but you can't prove.
Exactly.
So it's much more reasonable to think that he actually saw what he saw.
Yeah.
Especially considering, like, again, if you understand how hallucinations work, you would know that's not what happens. So again, like, this theory, it does not fit the facts. You can't just like imagine you saw something. Again, you had no concept of, you had no reason to believe, and you're actually in the opposite direction when he was alive.
Yeah. And like, going to your point, right? Just quickly touching on the legend theory, right? How can you say that like it's like a mythos or like some sort of political movement if it's one thing to come up with like, oh, this risen Messiah, there's this risen Messiah, but the fact that like we're going back to how the earliest manuscripts are dating to 40 AD, to almost like pretty much proclaim it almost immediately after crucifixion, it's really unheard of and also unnatural, going against the naturalistic explanation, right? Or to come to that conclusion in the first place. And it just goes to show that like that's crucial, because it goes back to the eyewitness accounts, right? Because in 1 Corinthians 15, 5-8, now like segueing into this hallucination theory, going again, it can't be shared.
Yeah.
The fact that it, like, even if you want to disregard, like, if you want to submit to the authority of scripture, like, let's throw that out the window, right? Let's just take the fact that Paul wrote that, hey, not just the disciples, not just myself, but also more than, there's literally hundreds and thousands, more than to over 500 people at once, right? That Christ appeared to post-crucifixion, basically his resurrection. How are those people going to say that they're hallucinating if they're all proclaiming the same thing? And another thing too,
and a lot of them were enemies of Jesus. Again, with Paul, not all of them were his followers, or like,
exactly.
right. So,
and another thing too, right, with the hallucination theory, with the disciples, to say that they hallucinated is also kind of interesting, because, like, yes, they were in grief and in despair, but let's also remember that when the women came from the tomb, what was their like initial response?
They immediately got up and ran to the tomb. They're like, "What?"
Yeah, and mind you too that like they didn't immediately believe it, right?
Yeah,
they were like skeptical too. There's no way that our Savior, or the
person
Christ,
who claimed to be the Savior.
Exactly. There's no way that they immediately, like, no, even they were skeptical, but it just goes to the point that, one, the tomb was empty, and two, they also witnessed Jesus appearing to them. Even Thomas, doubting Thomas, touched the hole in the hands.
Like, their doors were locked,
the flesh wounds, right? Yeah.
Their doors were locked. They were in hiding because they couldn't show their faces. But they were like, but then Jesus appears to them and he's like, "What?" And like exactly what you were saying, when they felt the holes in his wrists, they felt a hole in his side. You don't hallucinate something tactile.
And mind you, it was a physical touch too. It's not like you think
it wasn't a metaphorical touch.
It clearly was a physical touch.
All of them did that. All of them did that. You don't hallucinate something tactile. You don't. And and they were skeptical, but they didn't believe it at first. But they went up to go see it. It's like, what? We have to investigate this.
And then when they witnessed it for themselves, they then testified that, hey, this is an actual real thing that happened.
They went to their deaths still proclaiming something that they saw and felt and witnessed and all these things. And the thing is, liars make poor martyrs, right? If they were hallucinating, right? They don't, you don't go to your death, your violent, bloody, horrifying death, being tortured before you die too, by the way. You're tortured before you're executed. You don't do that for a lie or for, which we'll get to, the conspiracy theory, but also like for a hallucination. You just don't do that, right? It's hallucinations wear off, and you don't. Eventually, you realize that you're just seeing things, and like, dang, like, and even if you're going to like give like an outlier case of like someone who really was that delusional and they went to their death still proclaiming something that they were hallucinating, you can't say that for 500 people.
Yeah,
it's not.
You can
not
only
even,
say that
it's not even realistic
for yourself or an individual it's per individual.
You can
case,
even be generous and say a dozen people did that, but like you can't say that for all of them. That's a huge assumption, and we can't just go off of. You can't just believe something that you say just based off of assumption.
Yeah,
that's not how you do like archaeology. That's not how you do science. Like there's some. That's not even how you do philosophy or anything like that. There's some like fundamental assumptions that you have to make, but that's not one of them. Like you don't assume your conclusion before you get there. That's called circular reasoning. But yeah. And going to the for me, that's the most ridiculous one, the survival theory.
Yeah, isn't it also called? I think I've heard it as like the swoon theory.
Yeah, swoon theory.
Yeah,
that
swoon
like
theory, right?
Jesus like merely like appeared dead. He flatlined but came back. Whatever. But either way he survived crucifixion. Right.
I immediately in my mind I'm like, under the Roman jurisdiction, who were known for being so brutal that even the highest penalty of death as crucifixion, you're not going to make sure
you
he's
do
dead.
not understand how crucifixion works if you think that this is somehow survivable.
Yeah.
There is like, I honestly don't even know if you understand basic human anatomy and I don't know, blood loss for you to like if you honestly think that this is somehow survivable for anybody, like it's just seriously open a book, like read something, like read anything.
On top of that, under the Roman Empire,
yes,
they're all the more going to make sure you're dead.
Like exactly. First off, the Romans made sure that you were dead. They left no stone unturned. Even with Jesus himself, they checked to see if he was dead. Like, he's not breathing, he's not conscious. Let's make sure that he's dead. They stabbed him in the side.
Yeah.
They stabbed him in the side right here. And they went crosswise into his heart.
Yeah.
They also punctured a lung, by the way, on the way down. And how you know that is because when they pulled the spear out, water and blood came out.
Yeah.
Right. And that is a telltale sign of suffocation, death by suffocation. And that's how crucifixion worked. Right? Jesus was flogged, crucified, and stabbed in the side.
Exactly.
Now, the whole process of crucifixion, and if you want to watch like a really accurate, like scary accurate depiction of crucifixion, watch The Passion of the Christ. That is a scary, scary, accurate depiction of crucifixion.
Yep. And on top of that, he was whipped 39 times. That was
something like that.
On top of already having a crown of thorns on his head, having to bear and carry his cross,
I forget how far,
cross. But it wasn't. He had to carry it all the way up to the hill, where he was being crucified.
Yeah,
and then he gets whipped 39 times, and then he gets nailed to the cross, both on his wrists and his ankles, and then you proceed to have his body weight hanging.
Exactly.
Dehydration on top of that.
No, yeah,
and then you puncture him how many times? Right, like. Yeah. Who in the world is going to survive that?
No, I don't think that people understand even before crucifixion, the actual crucifixion, how brutal it was, because you were flogged, you were whipped, right? But you weren't just whipped with like what we think of as a whip, right?
Yeah,
and they use sticks and whips and stuff like that, but also use something called the cat of nine tails.
Yeah, exactly.
Where it is a whip that has multiple like ends to it.
Yeah.
Like multiple ends. And each one is tipped with like metal, with bone, with teeth, stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
And so when you're whipped with the cat of nine tails.
Yeah, it rips off the flesh too.
It hooks into your flesh and rips it off and then they whip you again and repeats the process. And it got to the point where like this is probably going to get us demonetized, but like it's it got floggings got to a point where blood vessels were exposed, where people were literally disemboweled. But and it was called the first death because that alone would kill somebody before they even got to crucifixion. But to your point, right? He had not, in addition to having been flogged with a cat of nine tails and all these things, and a crown of thorns as a mockery of his claim to be the king of the Jews, right? Crown of thorns piercing into his skull,
and
right?
potentially penetrating the brain already, like the neurosystems in there.
Yeah, his blood vessels.
There's no way, like you're gonna tell me you can survive that.
All of that blood loss, right? And then he had to carry his own splintery cross for miles to Golgotha. Then the instrument of his own death, right? And then he was like forced to lie down on that cross, and people often think that he was nailed through his palm, his hand. That is not true.
No, it's through the wrist.
It's through the bundle of nerves here in that wrist.
Yeah, and that's where you normally check for pulse too, right?
Yes,
that's where
exactly.
Like, it's vital.
Yeah, it's a vital part because exactly. You find your pulse there, so there's blood vessels there. There's a bundle of nerves there, and there's tendons there. It's a very that joint is a very vital part to the arm,
because they also do that so that you're unable to even try to resist.
Yes,
like which is painful to even think about.
Beyond imaginable pain.
Yeah,
it is not through the hand; it's through the wrist, and much worse, right? And then you're nailed through through your feet, through your ankles, right? Mm-hmm. And then you're finally put upright. And the way that crucifixion works, people think that you just like just hang there or whatever, right? It's much more beyond that, right? As you're hanging, you're actually you're stretched out and you're struggling to breathe because you have to hold yourself up by the parts that you're nailed to, right? By the way, right? You have to lift yourself up in order to breathe, because if you relax even just a little bit, right? Because you're tired because you're hanging up. Yeah. Right. You sink down, and this compresses your lungs, and it's extremely difficult to breathe. Yeah. And you're in the heat. You were just dragging this extremely heavy cross for miles.
Fatigue, extreme dehydration,
blood loss,
extreme blood loss,
and dehydration, and you're hanging there for
and
hours.
Extreme exposure too.
Exposure to heat and exactly bacteria to scavengers. Right. Like I there's no evidence for this, but I would imagine that he's already being attacked by birds, right? Because like at that point, if you're exposed like that, like crows are not going to care, right? If you're still alive and you're hanging like that, crows are not going to care.
And mind you, it's so difficult alone to keep yourself up there.
Yes,
because like what you mentioned, if you're
holding yourself up,
then you would sink down, and like I would honestly believe you would like create a bigger scar.
Yes, you're like tearing through your wrist again,
not
because
only
of the
wrist.
Body weight, because you're sinking down.
Yeah.
But even you lifting yourself up, it will like cause a bigger tear in your wrist again.
So you're tearing off the parts of the wrist and also parts of the ankles too. Yes. So like even that, I'm like, all right, I guess you want to say he survived.
No, not just that. Not only was he stabbed to the side, water and blood comes out, which means he died by suffocation. He's put let's say he survives all that. He's put into a tomb, a dark tomb, without food, water, or medical attention for 3 days. And you're trying to tell me that Jesus walked out of the tomb, rolled away the stone,
rolled away his own stone
that required multiple people to roll.
I think it was at least three, right?
Yes, and at least three, and it's guarded by Roman or Jewish guards. Like we'll get to that too. It's guarded by soldiers. And like you're telling me that he got past all of them. He survived without any food, water, medical attention. Got past the guards, rolled away the stone, and then appeared to his disciples. See, I'm alive. I rose from the dead. I pretended to die. And I rose from the dead. I'm who I claim to be. Like seriously, you think that Jesus went through all that trouble? If he's just a man, right? If he's just a man who's either lying or delusional, right? And he's trying to keep up appearances, and he's trying to appear to his disciples. You honestly think that he's going through all that trouble, or even like if it's even possible to do that, and just so we can say to his disciples, like, "See, I rose from the dead," when he really didn't, because he survived crucifixion. None of that is possible. None of that. It's nonsense. So this is the most ridiculous theory out there that tries to explain like through naturalistic means like why like how Jesus supposedly rose from the dead, or like no, not even rose from the dead, because that's the conclusion that we should come to. But why we should think that like this theory somehow explains like why people were able to see Jesus after he rose from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not even how they saw him after he died. Like Mary Magdalene, I think it was, right? She saw him and she thought he was the gardener.
Yep.
He looked fine. And when he appears to the disciples, and when Thomas sticks his finger in his wrist and in his side, he like it's bloodless. There's no bleeding wounds. He looks perfectly fine.
Mm-hmm.
So like the idea that he somehow survived all of that, and then like looks perfectly fine to the disciples after all that, just to keep up a lie, is just, come on, like that. What's more reasonable, right? Is this reasonable? Is this a reasonable theory? Right.
I just want to add really quick, like, let's assume even if the possibility he survived and got out of the tomb,
rolled the stone by himself.
Where are the sources of where he went after that?
Yeah.
Because like you also have to remember the fact that he was crucified, that attention is still garnered to him. So wouldn't the Roman Empire still be like trying to persecute him and get him?
Yeah.
Like there's no evidence or sources of like, let's assume he did survive. If one, he lived a peaceful, quiet life, or two, where he went after. There's like no evidence for that.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show that like, assuming again he survived, no one testified of him living like with the rest of the disciples for like an extended period of time. Like, no, there's none of that.
That, and also like, how do you reckon with the claim that he like was bodily assumed into heaven afterwards? Like,
exactly.
That doesn't make any sense. So yeah, this is just ridiculous on its face. Like, you do not understand Roman executions if you honestly think that this is somehow survivable. This is just ridiculous. This is nonsense.
Isn't it also like, on top of being like, if you're a Roman soldier and you were tasked not only just to make sure the victim is dead, but more so if Jesus was to be dead, wouldn't you be you have severe punishment?
You would be executed for dereliction of duty. Again, we'll get to that too. We'll get to like other forms of dereliction of duty.
Yeah,
because it's like the Romans are very serious about how they executed their tasks.
Exactly.
Because if you didn't execute your task, you were executed. Like there's no going around it. So the fact that like not like that wasn't the case of Jesus' death, when it comes to his burial and post burial, like that's a different story. But when it comes to like the actual execution, Jesus was executed. He straight up died. He was dead. Like there's no going around that. Let's go with the conspiracy theory, right? The idea that like the disciples like hatched they stole the body, or like they came up with a plan to move his body to make it look like he rose from the dead, and like see everybody, he rose from the dead. See, his tomb is empty. Like if there were like, there's actually like some discussion about whether the guards were Jewish or Roman. Let's go over both, right? If they were Jewish guards, why would they already rejected the idea of the Messiah rising from the dead as heresy, right? They wouldn't even accept it as an idea. So they would not go along with that bribery. Like no amount of money was going to do that, because they would be ostracized from their community. And remember, the disciples went into hiding because they thought they would be executed too. So why would the Jewish guards, like, who already saw the disciples as crazy, who already saw Jesus as crazy and as heretics, why would they go along with that for some money? That's not, no.
Exactly.
No. If they were Roman guards, again, they would be executed for dereliction of duty. The fact that they weren't, in the case of the crucifixion, shows that like Jesus, he really did die. That alone should tell you that he really did die, because no one was punished for him not dying. If they're Roman guards, we don't know the fate of the Roman guards after the if they were Roman guards. We don't know the fate of the guards after they were after Jesus supposedly rose from the dead, right? But if they're Roman guards, why would they take the bribe of these Jews who were their subjects? They were their subjects, and like under pain of execution for dereliction of duty, right? Why would, like, it's like if I'm a colonizer and I'm going to take the bribe of the people I colonized to propagate this this conspiracy. When I know that if I do that, I'm going to be executed. No, come on. Let's be realistic here. That's not going to happen.
I also just find it so fascinating how like people adhere to this theory, because going back to the disciples, right? The age range between is like between like teenager to like young adults at oldest, right?
Mhm.
These aren't like what do you call it? Well-seasoned adults, right? I just find it funny how you can believe like a bunch of fishermen can outwit or even outsmart a bunch of Roman guards.
Most of them were simpletons. Like, look at Peter. Peter had a third grade level education, could barely write Koine Greek. Like, it's just there's no way like him or anyone else, and we're not even getting to Paul yet because he doesn't even know about this yet.
Exactly.
But like we're talking about like the tax collectors in Matthew. We're talking about like a former prostitute in Mary. Like, do you honestly think that these guys are like gonna hatch a plot for some political insurrection or whatever, when again that was the whole reason why Jesus was executed in the first place, for political insurrection? You honestly think they're going to propagate that lie again under threat of the exact same fate?
Yeah.
Right. And another thing too is that, like, Jewish tradition, they don't move a body once it was buried. And like, if the Jews were if the disciples were like, man, like this Messiah guy, he really wasn't a Messiah. He was one of us. He was a Jew. Like, I guess we were duped. But they're not going to move a body once it's buried, right? If like even if Jesus was not the Messiah, even if he like was just like clearly lying or delusional, they weren't going to move a body once it was buried. It was just like, what's done is done. Like, it's over. Like, there's nothing to do with us anymore. Like, we're gonna go into hide. We can't show our faces anymore because we're so embarrassed, and we're afraid we might get executed or something like that. But they were not gonna move a body, and they're not gonna go through all that trouble, right?
And yeah, just on top of that, right? Like, going back to how you were mentioning, all of these people testifying that Christ rose from the dead, they died a martyr's death, still believing to the point of death that he did rise again. No one would die for a lie. One, because when you lie, it's out of personal gain, right?
Yes.
You're doing it for your own self. Either it'd be power, political power, your
For
own wealth,
money,
fame.
fame.
But the thing is, those are all benefits and conveniences to the lies, or to the liars per se.
Yeah.
The fact that these people, especially the disciples and apostles even, they died believing what they knew to be true, at the cost of their life, at the cost of persecution, at the cost of imprisonment, all of these things. It just goes to more of an inconvenience.
Yes.
Yet that didn't change or made them waver from what they believed to be true, or rather, what was true in the first place. Who is willing to die for like? Let's say that was a lie. Who's willing to go to the lengths to die for a lie? No one would. Even through the accounts of all of history, all martyrs' deaths were based on truths, not lies. So, like, how are we to put them to a standard that, they died for a lie?
Yeah, exactly. Liars make poor martyrs. And to your point that that the apostles who claimed to have seen Jesus after he had died and went to their bloody deaths still proclaiming that truth, it just goes to show that, like, liars make poor martyrs. They would not die those kinds of deaths for a lie. I mean, look at Paul's life, that he the life that he lived, described in 2 Corinthians 11, right? Somewhere like I think 24 or 27. He outlines like what he went through, and it's a horrible life. It's a miserable experience that he's going through, and for a lie, like, no one dies a painful, bloody death for a lie. People, and then critics, and especially atheists, right? They say, "Oh, but what about Muslim terrorists? They die for something that's clearly a lie, that you believe is a lie, I believe is a lie," and like, that. So like, the fact that happens does not make yours truth, right? Because that's, in fact, if anything, that proves that what you believe could be a lie, because like, it just goes to show that people do die for lies. And I'm like, no, it's one thing to kill somebody else for your beliefs. It's another thing to be to be singing worship songs as you're being fed to lions because you refuse to recant your statement about having seen Jesus, because that's what happened. People were executed. They didn't. It's one thing to kill others for your beliefs, which is completely abhorrent and does not make your beliefs true. It's another thing to be like, I'm dying for something that I refuse to recant. I'm not going to take this away. Like, why would I say something? Why would I take back something that I know to be true? Because you're going to kill me. Like, I know this to be true, and especially of something as infinite importance as your own salvation, right? If Jesus really did rise from the dead, and he did this to pay for the sins of humanity, and believing that gives you salvation, why would you recant that?
Yeah.
If if being threatened with death, right? These guys proclaimed that. They were like, no, because I know this to be true, and he was everything he said he was going to be, and he did everything he said he was going to do. I'm not going to take that. I'm not going to take back my statement, because that has to do with my salvation, and it's something that I really did see. Like, that's not something that they would have died for if it was a lie. Versus a Muslim terrorist is, I want my 72 virgins, I'm gonna like blow myself up in a train station. That it does not make it true. You having actually seen things that pertain to salvation and like like something supernatural like that, we should take that seriously. There's a reason why we take, for example, in a court of law, deathbed statements. We take that with the utmost seriousness. But it's the same principle when it comes to like to martyrs who died violent deaths. They were peaceful people who accepted their punishment.
Yeah.
But they died violent deaths, still proclaiming something that they claimed to have seen. But if it was a lie, then like that they just would not have died that way. They would not have died for a lie. They would have been like, okay, you know what? This is too much for me. I'm gonna take it back. I really didn't see him or whatever. Like, if I get fined or if I get imprisoned, like, fine, but like just don't kill me, like, please. I was joking, I was kidding, bro. Like, no, like, they died still proclaiming that Jesus actually rose from the dead, all of them. And again, like 2 Corinthians 11, Paul like just lays out his miserable life still proclaiming Jesus as having risen from the dead, that Jesus is the Messiah, that he's the salvation of mankind. Yeah, liars make poor martyrs. Yeah. And so because of all that, because all these different theories, right, of like the theory that like that Jesus' resurrection was a legend that developed over time, that the disciples hallucinated Jesus' post-mortem appearance, that Jesus somehow survived crucifixion, that the disciples merely just conspired to move the body to make it look like Jesus rose from the dead. None of them, even if they can explain some of the facts, they do not explain all of them, and you have to explain all of them. And there's only one way that we can explain the facts that we know. Remember that Jesus he was crucified, that he was buried, that his tomb was discovered empty, that people claim to have seen Jesus after he supposedly died, and that these people who saw him like had lifelong changes to their lives and went to their bloody deaths still proclaiming to have seen him. All these 4 facts, you can only explain them one way, and it is not through merely supernatural, not through merely naturalistic means, right? That's assumed. If the only way we can explain this fact is to come to the same conclusion that all 4 gospels come to, and Paul himself comes to in the New Testament, and that is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. That's the only conclusion that we can come to with the facts that we know. Yeah. So, therefore, the resurrection was a real event. It really did happen. Yeah. And I also like curated some resources afterwards for people to look up, to look at these things, right? there's like so many others that I can pull up, but these are just some of the people that I listen to, that I watch, some of the books that I've gone through. It's there's so many resources that are out there that show like why it is a reasonable thing to to believe that Jesus really died, really rose from the dead, and that he really was who he claimed to be. He really is God, because that's what that means. If he really did rise from the dead, like he said he would, it vindicates his other claims about himself.
Exactly.
Right. But I recently bought The Case for Christ, and like I don't know if you saw the movie, right?
Case for Christ.
Yes.
I haven't read that in a long time.
Yeah.
I need to reread it.
It's really good, and I saw the movie too. It was also really good too. I like the movie.
Because isn't it? It's about it's a journalist who's an atheist.
A journalist. Right? He's an atheist.
He's an atheist, right?
His wife is either already Christian or she converts to Christianity. He's like, that nonsense. Let me look into this.
Yeah,
and then, because he's a journalist by profession, he investigates different claims. He visits archaeologists. He visits theologians, scientists, all these different things, and he just comes to the conclusion like, wait, Jesus really did rise from the dead. He really is who he claimed to be, and he converted to Christianity, and he's been a Christian ever since. He's written other books as well, Christopher Creator. I forget other things that he wrote, but Lee Strobel. He had this channel. I think it was Faith Under Fire. Was it?
I think so.
Faith Under Fire. Yeah, he had that little program on TV. Really interesting. Cold Case Christianity. J. Warner Wallace is a former forensic investigator, and he basically goes through the same thing, same conversion story as Lee Strobel, and he goes through the same evidences, the same processes of coming to the conclusion that Christianity is true, and reasonable faith. William Lane Craig, he's one of my favorite Christian apologists, great philosopher. Honestly, a lot of the things he talks about are really, really difficult to understand. They're so high level philosophy and way above college level concepts to grasp. But he's very clear communicator. He's very straightforward, especially when it comes to outlining the gospel and stuff. He's like, if you watch his debate with Christopher Hitchens, who is one of my favorite atheists to listen to, honestly. It's unfortunate that he passed away still an atheist. His brothers are Christian though, Peter Hitchens. But if you watch that debate, William Lane Craig just thoroughly dismantles Christopher Hitchens. It was not even close. They debated at Biola University at 2010, 12, something like that. I don't remember. It may have been even 2009. But reasonable faith is just it's just, if you look at a systematic theology, essentially, reasonable faith is a systematic theology for specifically apologetics. It's just this is how to answer for specific topics about Christianity, and looking at why it's a reasonable thing to believe in Christianity. And obviously Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, it's such a clear cut this is the basics of Christianity, right? And why C.S. Lewis himself was a Christian. Yeah. And also, I think I recently discovered how to finally pronounce this correctly, right? Connectly, right? Connectly, yeah. I don't think I ever heard him say it himself, but I heard other people say that it was connectly. Okay, cool. But yeah, this is a topic that I really like, and I really think is important because if we like what I said in the beginning, and what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, right? If we don't actually understand why we believe what we believe, if we don't actually understand why it's reasonable to believe that that Jesus rose from the dead, then what we're doing is pointless. This podcast is pointless. Going to church is pointless. Bible study going on in the other room is pointless. Youth camp is pointless. All of it is pointless because Jesus never actually rose from the dead. But the good news is that it is actually
true,
a real thing. It is a good thing to know that it is completely plausible, completely reasonable. In fact, you should believe that this was a historical event.
Mhm.
Like, this is beyond reasonable. Like, this is something that you should believe. Right. And that vindicates everything that we're doing here. That, like, this is not for naught. This is something that is an investment towards eternity, right? And this is how we reach other people. This is how we edify the believers, which is, again, like, one of my goals. And my other goal was to reach out to the unbelievers, because in both cases I was trying to show that, like, this is not something that is just like this woo-woo magic stuff and just tradition for the sake of tradition, because this is something that you've always grown up believing, or like this is something that your friend always believed, but, like, you know, like, you're just like, you don't understand why. But yeah, this is something that is real. Like, this is just as real as, you know, the 100 Years' War in Europe between France and Britain. This is just as real as the bubonic plague, or the Great Emu War of 1917, I think. I don't remember what, 1913. There's
something there.
There's this invasion of emus essentially in Australia. It was really funny, and it was the only war in human history where the animals won. The emus won. The emus won against the
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, judges. I know you're very passionate, and this is very near and dear to your heart. And, you know, it's not just to me too, but specifically in presenting this and going back to 1 Peter 3:15, right?
Yeah.
How it's not just apologetics, like for the sake of apologetics, but why we do it in the first place, right? It's not just to be ready to make a defense of the hope that is in us, yet with gentleness and fear. But it's on the basis of our faith, which is the death and resurrection of Christ.
Yeah.
That not just the crucifixion was a real event, but the resurrection was also a real event. And that's why it goes back to 1 Corinthians 15. And if Christ has not been raised, then the lives of the apostles, the writings of the apostles, all the prophecies in the Old Testament, and even us as believers today, we're all, not only was the preaching in vain, but we're all living in vain.
Yeah.
It's all pointless. We're
all
still
dead in our sins.
Yeah.
Or sin doesn't exist, and we're just like living our lives, and the whole universe is a pointless exercise in I don't even know. Exercise in what? It's just a pointless existence.
But yeah, I really appreciate your heart, your dedication, and your time, judges. And if I may just add like another source to these wonderful sources already, which is
this is not even exhaustive. Like, this is just some of the things.
Like let alone mere Christianity. Like if there's one I would like really recommend, it's by C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity. Such a good book. Really great read. If I were to add another one, on top of like already mentioning, I need to reread, or I want to reread and maybe even rewatch The Case for Christ. The Case for Christ, right?
Yes.
Another book that recently, about 2-ish years ago, I read was a book called Surviving Religion 101. It's I think the subtitle is Letters to a Christian Student, on like how you keep the faith in college, especially. And I believe it's by Michael Kruger. Michael J. Kruger is the author. I finished it 2 years ago. And how I came across this book was when I was about to enter my first year of college back in 2022. My dad gifted me this book. And he said, not just as a gift, but he recommends that I read it. And that book, a part of it touches on the reliability of and like the proof of the resurrection, right? That it was a real event. But it also talks about, basically it deals with apologetics too. Like, what do you call it? Like the exclusivity of Christianity, right? You deal with like how the world views Christianity as, like they view it to be Christian intolerance per se.
Yeah.
That's what they call it, right? The morals we grew up with, how we can come to the conclusion that it's not just because our parents raised us or because we hear the church say it. Like these are actual things that we can adhere to from scripture alone, right? And all these other things, like how it talks about the reliability of the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, so much more. It's a really great book on how, especially in the world today, especially in college, like campuses, they're deconstructing Christianity and they're just trying to constantly debate and like, hey, what you're Christians, you're supposed to love and love, so like why can't you like accept us for who we are? And it goes back to like not just encouragement but also edification.
Mm-hmm.
Like how you can stick to what you believe but still, like going back to this presentation, like you still are outreaching to the unbelievers, right? It's doing it with gentleness and respect.
Yeah.
So it's not only an encouragement of like how you can be grounded and keep contending for the faith, right? Like it says in Jude 3, you contend for the faith.
Mm-hmm.
It also shows you how to not just be confident and assured of yourself, like of salvation and all these other things, how you can cater that in being in debating with reasonable arguments too. Like, hey, okay, like what we just did, let's bring it to a level where like we can all agree, like historical reliability, the standards, like, hey, we didn't even touch much on like, you know, a higher authority per se, right? Because the scripture has a divine authority, but even without really bringing that into the picture,
just treat it as historical documents with no special
there's
powers
already
or anything like that.
an
right?
astounding amount of like the numbers are astounding and the evidence is surreal that like, hey, even if we didn't really bring the divine authority of scriptures, which is a whole other topic we touched on, right? But in another episode, but it just goes to show that even when we treat it to the standards and procedures of other historical events and documents, it really is reliable.
It still stands the scrutiny. Like if you like any of the techniques that we just use, they're all part of textual criticism, which isn't exclusive to biblical studies. Looking at any work of antiquity, any historical documents, anything like that, even as recent as like the 1960s, right? Just take that for example, right? Use textual criticism, and we will come to like the similar conclusions. Not like this person or that person resurrected, but I mean like we can understand the veracity of a historical document by using the same techniques here. Because all I'm doing is using something that can be applied to anything else. Like again, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Genghis Khan, any shogunate in Japan, anyone in Africa, like literally anything that's written down, like use textual criticism and see if it holds scrutiny. The New Testament is just as it just has the same level of veracity, if not more, than other things that we consider to be historical. It's just there's no difference. If you don't even have to treat the New Testament as like this like magical divine like revelation or whatever. You can just treat it as any secular historian, just treat it as like a normal historical document or a set of historical documents. Really, just treat it like that, a normal piece of paper, and you will like come to the conclusion that it's making a supernatural divine claim. Yeah.
Because like again, I don't need to necessarily sway people to like, oh, you must adhere to divine authority. Let's look at it just for what it is.
Yeah.
And like the documents themselves, the number of documents and the number of manuscripts and the number of archaeological digs too, they're in the far thousands more than
recent ones too.
Yeah.
There's recent ones in, I think it was Jericho, was it?
I think so, yeah.
And there's a recent archaeological dig that it's just like, bro, like this is literally what we've been talking about in the Old Testament. Like,
but yeah, that just goes to show like even the numbers themselves. Like, sure, let's say like you may have a problem with adhering or even believing they're true. Let's just talk about that number in the first place. Like, that's far more than Julius Caesar's manuscript. Because I think one of his things, he had only had 10 documents, right?
Yes.
And I think that was also written about hundreds of years after the original, right? The manuscript for that specific event.
For Julius Caesar, I don't remember like how long after his death, but regardless, it's 10. You have 10.
You only have 10 documents.
And even let's just say that it's written within the same period of time as the Gospels. You still have only 10.
Exactly.
Versus like the Gospels written within 7 years.
Yeah.
Of
and in the Greek language alone, it's 5,000, right?
Over 5,000 in the Greek language alone. Plus the other documents, other languages, 20,000 manuscripts.
Because there's Greek, Aramaic, Hebrew, and then there's much more, right? Like Latin,
Syriac,
Coptic too,
and Arabic, even Arabic. Because yes, it was transmitted over to Arabia. That's how we know. That's how we know Muhammad got like he heard a lot of the stories that were circulating around that time in the 7th century. But yeah, this is just basic textual criticism. And again, like this can be applied to any other historical event or anything like that. And it's just, for some reason, people just want to like automatically discount and then put Christianity in another category. And even if we apply the same standard to them, to Christianity, it's like we would come to the conclusion that Christianity is true, but we can't do that. So like, let's hold it to a different standard. It's like, I don't know, man. It's unfair. But if you're a reasonable person, you use textual criticism and you look at the different theories that try to explain away the resurrection without coming to the conclusion of resurrection. And it's just like, bro, the only way to explain the facts, especially since we know that the New Testament is reliable, is that like Jesus actually rose from the dead. This is a real thing. You can trust the Gospels, you can trust the New Testament, and like it's only reasonable to conclude that Jesus really rose from the dead. Yeah.
And with that, to bring it to a close, I just want to read a couple verses in 1 Corinthians 15, thus concluding that the resurrection of Christ is a real event. Insert, starting with verse 55 of chapter 15. O death, where is your sting? O death, where is your victory? For the sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Which is the same reason those who died professing and proclaiming the risen Christ is a real event. They did not sway from that truth. And all the more, as it said in verse 58, they know that they're not laboring in vain.
Nothing
because
that
Christ
we're doing here
has risen from the dead.
Nothing that we're doing here is in vain. Yeah.
So with that, judges, any quick final words to share with the audience?
I recently bought a new book too, about the same topic. It's published relatively recently, I think like 2021. Body Approved by Jeremiah Johnston. I only bought it like last month or something, so I didn't add it to this to this slide. But yeah, like it's a topic I'm passionate about. Like honestly, like the argument for the resurrection is like one of my favorite arguments in favor of Christianity, in favor of like God's existence and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, that whole thing hinges on why Christianity even exists in the first place.
But yeah, like I just love apologetics in general. But yeah, like if there's any like questions or comments that people have, like in the description, or like if people come up to me, like I am like way more than willing. I'm happy and willing to have a discussion about this topic, because like if you have any doubts about Christianity, or if you're really trying to come at me and you're trying to talk down on Christianity, let's have that discussion. I am more than willing to talk about this. If you have further questions, or if you're like, if you think that I'm weak in my reasoning is weak in one of these my presentation or whatever, which is fair, right? Like if there's a weakness in my argument, like that's fine. Like I'm more than willing to hear that out. But let's have that discussion, because like this is not just an ego trip or anything like that, or an exercise in intellectual superiority. Like this is about salvation, right? Like if this is true, then you should believe it, because again, it's Acts 16:31. Believe in Jesus Christ and you'll be saved. Because if this is true and Jesus really died and rose again, why did he do that? It's because he needed to do that to bear our sins. Because if he had not done that, then we're condemned. And I don't want you to be condemned. I don't want to be condemned. And if God made a way for us to be reconciled to him, then why not take that way? Why not take that path? He gave us a path to reconciliation. Let's take that path. And you know, this is evidence and reason to believe in that. Yeah. So I urge people to like be a good Berean. Acts 17:11. Search the scriptures, and not just the scriptures. Search these books. Watch videos by these guys. Like look into this yourself. Don't just take my word for it. I'm presenting reasonable arguments. I'm presenting evidence and all that. I hope this was convincing for you. But like, if you're still not convinced, look this up yourself. Look up counter arguments to what I'm saying. Don't just like look at one side of it. Look at counter arguments and see if it's as convincing as the evidence that I presented. Do your own research. That's perfectly fine. But I urge you to to sincerely look at the facts and see where the facts lead you to, because you know the truth shall set you free.
Yep.
Like you look at the facts, you look at the evidence, you look at the truth, and it's just incredibly liberating. Like, wow, like Christianity is true. This is real stuff. And I know that I'm not condemned if I believe in this. So like, of all the more importance, right? So that's where my burden's at.
Appreciate your time, judges,
Oh, yeah,
your commitment, and your heart and willingness to not just learn about this for yourself, because that's ultimately where it begins on the individual level. What does this mean to us? Then going furthermore into how you share that, not only expressing your faith, but also contending for your faith. Because a lot of people would express the faith, but they don't really know how to, or they are
that's perfectly
perhaps lacking the fundamentals, which is perfectly fine.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that.
Because at one point or another, they will get to that point, right?
Yeah, everyone has their areas of growth.
Yeah.
And that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. I just want to again thank you and appreciate you for your time, especially for contending for the faith, because this is an important thing. And this is the most important thing, which goes to the Great Commission, right? Where we are to evangelize and share the gospel that Christ indeed died and rose again, not just stayed dead.
Yeah.
He rose again, which corroborates his claims of divine authority, of divine origin, that he is indeed God, not just man.
And he did this to pay for the sins of humanity, that we are no longer condemned because we have a path of reconciliation back to God. And like my policy prescription that I was advocating for in my persuasive speech, again, Acts 16:31, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you'll be saved. Like that is my exhortation to everyone listening. Yeah.
And with that, as for my final words, actually, his name is up there. Cross-examined from Dr. Frank Turek. I would like to basically say what he would say whenever a skeptic and or an unbeliever would ask a question specifically pertaining to the reliability or if the resurrection was a real event. He would always pose the question back to the person, the individual asking, if Jesus rose from the dead, or if Christianity were true, would you believe it? And it goes to, here we are, we presented the facts, more so judges exposited the facts on the resurrection. And what I'm trying to get at is, what will you do with with these facts? And it comes to the matter of the heart. You know, head knowledge is great and all, or, even, the head matter. But what matters is, are you willing to believe? There's a lot of evidence already pointing that it was real, but it's still up to you, the individual, especially to the unbeliever. Are you willing to believe that the resurrection, that Jesus Christ died and rose again for your sins? So with that concludes episode 9. Episode 9, in total, the 3rd episode of season 2 on reminiscing on the resurrection, why it was a real event, and how can we prove it was a real event. So with that, again, judges, one last time, I thank you for all that you have done in preparation and in the presentation of this very topic that is near and dear to both our hearts, and more so, as it would be, we hope and pray it would be an encouragement to those who are believers, and perhaps to those who haven't had that personal relationship with Jesus, that it will at the very least bring you closer in a way to do more research or to wrestle with, is Jesus real or not? So with that, this concludes Reminisce on the resurrection, and we'll see you guys on the next episode.